So we move on to session 9. We're picking up steam a little bit here as we work our way. We're at the midway point in the Gospel of Matthew and sort of a little bit beyond midway in our course. And last week, oh, by the way, does everybody have a set of the notes? There's a one sheet outline. There's copies floating around if you didn't get one. Last week we looked at what is an ongoing theme in Matthew, particularly when we cross the border into chapter 11 of the Gospel after seeing the powerful, positive portrayal of Jesus as teacher and healer that commanded the early chapters of Matthew. But we saw with chapter 11 and moving forward at chapter 12 and then taking a leap ahead to chapter 23, the woes against the scribes and Pharisees, that opposition to Jesus is part of the gospel story, an essential part of it. It prepares us in a way for the death of Jesus, as we were talking last week, that emerges out of the commitments of his mission. It's not something that just happens at the end, but is sort of accumulating in the gospel story as we go along and intensifying. And we'll see more of that this evening. What we're looking at tonight, as you have already seen if you read through this section, chapter 13, the beginning of the parable discourse, down to right before the community discourse of chapter 18 that we'll take up next time, that we're in a long and varied, I'd say, part of the gospel. It's drawn mainly from the Gospel of Mark and follows the sequence of Mark, but Matthew does, as we've seen typically throughout this gospel, incorporate materials from his other source Q and also some unique materials that are found only in Matthew's gospel. Jack Dean Kingsbury, a well-known Lutheran interpreter of Matthew who wrote early on a book about the parable chapter, as we'll see in a moment, thought that chapter 13, particularly the middle of chapter 13, was like a tremendous turning point. It's probably, he probably emphasized it too much, people temper it. But what he was pointing to is that this part of the gospel, that Jesus, who had been speaking to the crowds and healing the crowds will still be present. But there's a decided turn towards the disciples that begins especially in the middle of the parable discourse when he leaves the crowds and focuses on instruction for the disciples. And this will really, it's true, the same thing happens in the Gospel of Mark. As you begin to move, as we'll see in the journey to Jerusalem, the focus of the gospel is much more intensely on the disciples and on the meaning of discipleship, and that will be certainly true in Matthew's gospel, as we'll see as we consider it tonight. Because of the stretch of material and the varied material here, what I tried to do is sort of extrapolate, as we look at it tonight in our first session, at some of the almost thematic chunks here that occur in this section. And I try to put them in something of an analytical way, if you like, in under Roman numeral number 2. And we'll get to that. But one of the things that's introduced in this section, beginning in chapter 16, right after the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, you have two things happening. One is the first passion prediction is made, and the movement of the gospel, Matthew taking his cue from Mark, is now from Galilee towards Jerusalem. We begin, in effect, what's called the journey narrative of this gospel. All three of the synoptics use this perspective. It's found originally in Mark. I put there on your notes 8:22 to 10:52, and it begins up in the northern. Whoops, sorry about that. I better use my left arm, I guess. It begins up in the northern region of Caesarea Philippi, which is right on the border with present-day Lebanon, and then moves down through Galilee, down the Rift Valley, the Jordan Valley, down to Jericho, and then up to Jerusalem. And in Mark's Gospel, that section, 8:22 to 10:52, is a very clearly delineated section of the Gospel, and it's there that most of the very intense sayings about discipleship, about taking up one's cross, about losing one's life, about leaving behind family and possessions and so on. These are found in this segment of the Gospel, and Matthew follows that. I put his references, 6:13 to 20:34. In chapter 21, verse 1, we enter into Jerusalem. There's the solemn entry. So we are going to be on this section for a couple more sessions as we look at chapter 18 and following. But tonight we're taking sort of the first chunk of this. And it's very important, this metaphor of the journey, of being on the hodos. We saw it pop up in the preaching of John the Baptist at the beginning about straightening the way of the Lord. And in Greek, the word is hodos, as we had said before, and it means the way, which can mean the actual physical path, or it can mean movement along the way. It can mean the journey. We have the same, I think, choice in English. By the way, we have to thank one of our generous donors for giving us nice ink markers saying thanks, Gene. But this metaphor that is a very pervasive metaphor in a lot of human literature, Ulysses and Travels with Charlie and what have you, for human existence. It so fits, leave-taking, having a purpose, danger, baggage, all of these kinds of conditions for travel that are perennial, even in the modern times, was picked up in world literature for human life as a journey, and certainly in biblical literature. It already starts in the patriarchal narratives with Abraham journeying from his homeland at the command of God, moving down into the Fertile Crescent, he and his family and his cattle. And certainly comes to the fore in Exodus, the beginning of really the formation of the people Israel is cast as a journey to the Promised Land. We know this profound, overarching metaphor that's so pervasive in the Hebrew Scriptures. And in a certain way, the whole notion of exile and return recapitulates this notion of the journey, which covers so much also of the literature of the Scriptures. And it's incorporated in the New Testament, the journey of Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, which is in Luke's Gospel, which greatly expands this metaphor. It speaks even of Jesus' exodus, which is about to take place in Jerusalem. So Matthew, too, has this. We don't want to lose sight of this broader framework in which we are now set as we move through the Gospel in this way. And it's punctuated here by the Passion predictions, which become, in a sense, sort of stating, I'm going to move this because it all has to do with the clip, which side the clip puts out the thing. But see if this works. This is high tech. Is that good? Can you hear me and everything still? All right. So oops. It's not working well. The problem is that I don't know how to do this. Excuse me for this. The clips are going in the wrong direction. Does that make sense? You can't put them on this side. Anyway, forget it. All right. So the Passion predictions that occur in Matthew, which he draws directly from Mark, really lay out the journey. He's on our way to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man is going to be handed over. It describes with the different levels of detail the experience of the Passion, and then predicts the resurrection as well. And Matthew also absorbs what I think is a kind of fundamental coloration of the journey from Mark, namely that Galilee is the place of the mission. Galilee is where the disciples are first called. It's where we've had the mission discourse in Matthew's text and the description of his healing and his teaching. It's a robust description of the mission of Jesus. Whereas Jerusalem, there it's pure conflict, as we'll see in chapters 21 and through 24. And then the Passion narrative beginning in chapter 26 and 27. And the same is true in Mark. Jerusalem becomes the place of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And there's a return to Galilee, a return that is announced in Mark, but not narrated. They come to the empty tomb and they're told to go to Galilee. The women are to bring the message to the apostles to go to Galilee. There they will see him. In Matthew, you have an actual narration, as we'll see at the very climax of the gospel in chapter 28, 16 to 20, when the risen Christ meets the disciples on a mountaintop in Galilee. So Galilee, it's the return to Galilee, is the inauguration of the Christian mission. It's the recapitulation of what was already anticipated in the opening chapters of the gospel. So here, the journey to Jerusalem, we don't want to forget this framework that's going to be in the backdrop of our looking at the Gospel of Matthew over the next couple of segments. But we want to look now at some of the content of this, and as I say, I try to arrange it in, not necessarily in sequence, but according to sort of clumps of material. And the very first is the parable discourse. We've come to our third discourse. We had the Sermon on the Mount, and we had the mission discourse in chapter 10, and now we're entering into the parable discourse. Here, if you have compared Mark's text again, Mark chapter 4 is the one place in Mark, maybe not the only one, there's chapter 13, but within the Galilean ministry, it's a discourse in a way, that Mark begins with the parable of the sower. He has an explanation of the purpose of the parables, and then adds a couple more parables to end the chapter. And Matthew absorbs that, but expands this chapter and changes its tones in a couple of ways. And we might even think at the outset, the question that's raised in this discourse is, why parables? The disciples ask this, why do you speak to them in parables? And Mark and Matthew give different answers. In Mark, Jesus speaks to the people, those outside of the disciples, in parables, so they will not understand. Okay? In Matthew changes the wording of this to give it a moral reason. It's because their hearts are hardened, because they refuse to listen, because they don't see. That's why they get parables. So the parables are not because to prevent them from understanding. Matthew edges up to that, but doesn't accept that interpretation of Mark. But they get parables because they have placed themselves in a position where they cannot understand. They're not open to the message of the parables. And commentators, as you have experienced, that the parable sort of pushes you to think about the nature of speech. And speech is both revealing and cloaking meaning. Right? All speech. Okay? Maybe if we didn't say anything, sometimes it's better than, But speech reveals, but speech is also limited and masks reality. And that's sort of the the feeling about parable, why Jesus speaks in parables. There's a very classic definition that you may have come across in your reading by C.H. Dodd, who was a great British exegete, worked back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, was quite a noted scholar on the Johannine literature. But he wrote a book on the parables of the kingdom, and he defines the parable this way. It's a very British definition, I think, He says, quote, "At its simplest, a parable is a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought." So it's a simile or a metaphor drawn from common life. A man went out to sow seeds in a field, a merchant looking for fine pearls, a shepherd with his sheep. But then it arrests the reader by its vividness or strangeness. Very often in the parables, there's something slightly out of kilter or something unusual, a combination. The woman, and we have here in Matthew, one of his parables unique to him, the amount of leaven and the amount of flour. It's, as people say, there's enough bread to feed a village. It's huge. The amounts are huge. Or there's something happening in the parable that we stop for a moment. And then it leaves the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. And this is a very important part of the parable. The parable it's not discursive, it's not explanatory, it's not spelling things out. It engages the reader. You have to, a listener, you have to get into what is the meaning of the parable, as the disciples ask in this discourse. John Donahue, a wonderful New Testament scholar, has written a book called Jesus as Parable. He says Jesus himself has this kind of parabolic nature. He's a human being, but there's something sufficiently vivid or strange about him that makes us say, who is this? Who is this? He doesn't spell it out. You have to engage in order to understand. And that is part of the meaning of the parable chapter here. If you have the text in front of you and just, how to divide this, there are many ways that people have thought about this. But as I mentioned before, Jack Kingsbury looked at verse 36. Do you see verse 36? Sort of in the middle of it. He left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached them, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And so he saw this as this great turning point, that the crowds who are present at the beginning with the disciples, as he's teaching them in the opening lines of chapter 13, they're sort of left behind. The crowds will appear again, but now the focus is on the disciples who have been gifted with the revelation of the kingdom, and he will instruct them. But that may be too much weight to bear, and others have proposed a threefold division of chapter 13. If you just sort of trace it, excuse me, with your finger there, you can see it begins with the parable of the sower. And this is exactly parallel to Mark. And then in verse 10, there's this section on why parables. And this is where Matthew alters the interpretation of Mark, where Mark says they get parables to prevent them from understanding Jesus. For Matthew, they get parables because they, in a sense, place themselves in a position not to understand. But you, he has down there verse 16, your eyes blessed, for they see, your ears, for they hear. Many righteous prophets and righteous people long to see what you hear but did not hear it. Matthew adds that. He has a much more positive, as we've seen all along, understanding of the disciples' perception of Jesus. But then after the section on the sower and then the question about the purpose of parables, you have the parable of the sower explained, okay? And this is where people will draw the first segment. This is very close to Mark, and you have this sequence of the parable and then the explanation of it that Jesus gives about the different dispositions. We'll double back to that. But then in verse 24, Matthew goes on to add another parable that is not found in Mark. And so the second section, if you like, is chapter 13, 24 to 43. So 1 to 23, and then 24 to 43. And here is a similar pattern as Mark has given at the beginning, the parable of the weeds among the wheat. We'll see this a very typical motif of Matthew. And then he throws in the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. And then in verse 34, you have again a discussion about the use of parables. He told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. This is Matthew's material. And then in verse 36 and following, down to 43, he explains the parable of the wheat and the weeds, as Mark's pattern had set before regarding the parable of the sower. And then you come to the final segment of this. There's a collection of three parables again on the part of Matthew. The treasure hidden in the field, the merchant in search of fine pearls, and then the net thrown in, this sort of judgment parable that comes. And the final conclusion, 51 and 52, a text that we had looked at early on in first talking about Matthew. So the structure, Matthew seems to imitate the structure that's in Mark chapter 4, but he extends it by adding parables that are not found in Mark's gospel. And so what is some of the message we can draw from Matthew? There's a couple of things that he has in common with Mark, but there's something very distinctive that is also found only in Matthew's side. First of all, these are all parables of the kingdom. You notice how they start off. The kingdom of heaven may be compared. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. So this is all about the notion of the reign of God. And for Mark and for Matthew, there are certain qualities that emerge about the kingdom. One is that it's hidden. It doesn't come with the kind of blaring of trumpets. It can be overlooked. It starts small. It's unobtrusive. And yet it's also bountiful. This especially is emphatic in Mark, but Matthew picks it up, the hundredfold, exploding harvest of the kingdom. So something that starts very small, the mustard seed, the seed thrown on the soil, the different dispositions of the soil, but where it's good soil, it ends with a tremendous bounty at the end. And both Matthew and Mark emphasize that, the harvest that comes. But it's also precious, desirable, something life-giving. And this will be something that Matthew picks up in the parables that he will add in the latter section. It's something worth your life to acquire. And so the kingdom of heaven is the focus of this, and it's in these stories that life breaking in unexpectedly, overcoming obstacles, small, fragile beginnings, and then exploding into harvests, into very bountiful harvests, into great yields of dough and so on, discovery of treasure, and as you have in so many of these stories. But also for Matthew, and here's where you get into some of his distinctive and intriguing things, and will bring us back to the text here. Certainly, he follows Mark in speaking of what are the dispositions for the reception of the kingdom. And you find that in the explanation of the parable of the sower in verse 18 and following. So a few little twists of Matthew, but very similar to Mark. So here the parable of the sower, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it. This is very important in Matthew, understanding. We're going to see this sunemi, understanding with your heart. It's not just notional. It's understanding in the sense of empathy with, of resonating with, being in harmony with. So if you hear the word and you don't understand it in this sense, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown, and that is what is sown on the path. For the one on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. Here you get a sense that this allegorical explanation on the part of Jesus is sort of a post-Easter reality. It's speaking of trouble and persecution that's coming on account of the word, on account of the preaching of the early community. So it's speaking of people who, receive it enthusiastically, but then run into conflict, as we're seeing in the gospel, and they have no roots. They fall away. This is also very strong in Mark's text as well. And then there's another set of obstacles that's very interesting here. As some of our present discussion going on in the church, As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. And, we think in this gospel of the rich young man and the stories of leaving behind possessions and so on, that here it is another way the word can be blunted and the seed does not come to life. But for the one sown on good soil, this is the one that hears the word. Matthew adds, understands it, and who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So this notion of understanding, do you not yet understand? Do you understand this? Is very important in Matthew's gospel. It's Jesus teaches as well as heals, and the teaching is to be absorbed with deep empathy, with an open heart. It's understanding in that sense, not simply analyzing the meaning of the text. So the dispositions of the word are something we pull from here. But the next one I put there, living in a mixed world of good and bad. This is very special to Matthew's gospel. And you see it here in the explanation of the parable of the weeds among the wheat, the very story itself. Should we pull up, the weeds are sown among the wheat, should we pull them up? And he says, no, in verse 30, let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I would tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, bind them in the bundles to be burned, gather the wheat into my barn. And then you see in the explanation of the parable of the weeds, again, the same idea that, we're living in a mixed reality. And one of the texts here that's, I think, very beautiful in Matthew, I may have told some of you this story before, but if you look at verse 38, when the disciples asked him to explain the parable of the weeds, and he says, the field is the world, okay? The cosmos. And this is, as many commentators have noted, the world. Not the church, not Israel, the world. The field is the world in which the arena. Years ago, when I was in the graduate studies in Louvain, we used to go over, you could get books dirt cheap, in England and went to Blackwell's, the big bookstore, and they had a big, like a tray or a car, a table full of used books, and you could get them all for £1, and get any one of them for £1. And I saw a leather-bound copy of J.C. Hawkins' book Horae Synopticae, which was a bunch of tables about the synoptic problem. Believe it or not, I was thrilled to see this. Most people would not. And it was in somebody's collection, and the person had annotated a lot of the stuff in there. It was leather bound, and so I bought this back. And on the boat coming back, I looked, and on the inside cover, presumably the original owner had written in Greek, "Ho de agros estin ho cosmos." And I thought, wonder where that's from, Virgil or some Greek author. And only later, much to my deep embarrassment, I found it's from the Gospel of Matthew that I had been spending every living moment, looking at. So, but it's arresting, isn't it? I mean, the field is the world. And that, I think, is part of Matthew's mission sense here, that and this will become, clear in the final scene of the gospel. Go out to all the nations proclaiming the gospel. And so that Matthew is, there's good and bad. There's a mix here. And it's not for the community to try to create a pure situation, pull up all the weeds. I keep thinking of the images that Pope Francis has been using about the church. It's a big tent. You don't, it's like a field hospital, people bringing in the wounded. You don't ask them about their cholesterol levels or sugar levels. You take care of the wounds. It's a mix. The world is a mix, and you have to be participant in it. And that is the spirit of something that Matthew adds. And he also adds it to the last parable in this about the fish, which is only found in Matthew's gospel in verse 47. The net thrown into the sea and catches fish of every kind. So there's a sorting at the end. But in the meantime, you're swimming in a sea of great variety, and you're working in a field with weeds and wheat, and this is where your mission is. You're to be part of it. The judgment comes. This is typical also of Matthew's theme, but he has this sense of the community is working in the real world, not in some self-contained, enclosed world. And then the final thing in the parable chapter, the need for full commitment. And this particularly is reinforced in the parables that Matthew adds at the end. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. He goes and sells all he has and buys that field. You have a sense of these call stories, discipleship stories again. Or it's like a merchant in search of fine pearls, finding one pearl of great value. He went and sold all that he had and bought it. So this total investment, total commitment. We see it in the story coming up in chapter 19, the rich young man and so on. Sell what you have and come follow me. This intensification of discipleship here, a full commitment that is needed. So the parable chapter that we're hardly doing justice to here, but it's Matthew has absorbed it from Mark, but has infused in it the spirit of mission and the spirit of a kind of realism about the world in which the community will operate, and also emphasizes the importance of the commitment, which reverberates off of the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower, that it's the one, the good soil, it's that intense commitment that leads to the harvest. So the parable chapter comes here, and one commentary I was looking at said to note that the parable chapter is surrounded by, in Matthew's version, by two interesting stories about kinship with Jesus. One is at the end of chapter 12 that comes right before the parable chapter. It's the story, we had talked about this, of the true family of Jesus. His mother and brothers looking for him, and who is my mother and brother? Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. No fathers in the kingdom, by the way. I think that's quite deliberate in all of these texts. There are no fathers because there's only one Father. You have that in chapter 23 where he speaks about this. So we're all brothers and sisters. There's no paterfamilias in the community. So that segment, and then in verse 54 of chapter 13, the story of coming into his hometown. And here again, there's offense, and no prophet is without honor except in their own country and in their own house. So the people close to Jesus, his family, his hometown, do not appreciate him. It's the outsiders. We saw this, if you remember last week, we looked at the sayings about Capharnaum, Chorazim, Bethsaida. If the deeds worked in you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. The people of Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah. So there's this sense that the people who should be responding, and certainly the leaders fall into this, and even the family of Jesus and his towns that he associated with, they find him an obstacle. And it's the people in the margins that appreciate Jesus and are disposed to accept him. And I think part of that is also deep down in the gospel, this notion of what's going to happen with the inclusion of the Gentiles in the community, those on the perimeter, if you like, that will receive this. Let's turn a page, if you're game, to this second segment here as time roars on. And this is throughout this section, Matthew continues to portray Jesus as a healer. And if anything, ups the ante. And we have here, if I just tried to assemble the various types of texts. Some of them are what's called nature miracles. So not just the healings that we saw in chapters 8 and 9, the leper, the Simon's mother-in-law, the servant of the centurion, and so on. But here now the multiplication of the loaves. Twice, as Mark has. He draws each of these from Mark's. The feeding of multitudes of hungry people from few provisions. One of the interesting things about this, if it's the kind of thing that piques your interest, is if you look at the second story in chapter 15, verse 32. This again is our, I think the intelligence of the redactor going on here. In Mark's text, the two feeding stories, chapter 4, chapter 6, are placed on the two sides of the lake. Okay. So chapter 4, with 12 baskets of fragments left over, is on the western side of the lake. It's Jewish territory, clearly. And the surrounding context emphasizes that. Then he crosses over in a rather tortured way. If you look in Mark's gospel, in this, where he describes Jesus coming to this. This is in chapter, where is it here now? The feeding of the 4,000, 8:1, if you look in 8:1. And by way of the Decapolis, look in verse 31 of chapter 7. Okay, can you see that right before this story? This is Mark again. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and Sidon, so he was up there with the Syrophoenician woman, and he came back towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Okay, now this is a very, if you were tracking this with your GPS system, you would see that this is a very strange, because, the Sea of Galilee, this is very rough, So Tyre and Sidon is up here in Lebanon, and so it says he returns to Capharnaum, but by way of the Decapolis. This is the Decapolis over here. Okay. So he's going all out of his way. And the reason Mark is doing that, it may be, first of all, that he doesn't know the geography, but he knows Decapolis is Gentile territory. We've been there before in chapter 5. And so the second feeding is for the Gentiles. And there's 7 baskets left over. It's perfect. Now, Matthew, if you take a look at Matthew's text, look at verse 29 of chapter 15. It's hard to see that this isn't deliberate, you know. After Jesus had left that place, he passed along the Sea of Galilee, went up to the mountain. This is a summary, I'll come back to this, of healing. It's only in Matthew's Gospel. It's very beautiful. It's like the Sermon on the Mount, now repeated, but with healing. And he sits down, and they all come to him, the crowds, acclaim him. And then verse 32, Jesus called his disciples, said, I have compassion for the crowd. They've been with me now for 3 days, have nothing to eat. It's on the Galilee side. He doesn't mention Decapolis or anything like. So this is still in Israel, the second healing. Matthew is not ready to have Jesus feed the multitudes of Gentiles. Okay? Remember that whole geography that we have talked about of mission, that Matthew is trying to restrict the activity of Jesus during his lifetime to Israel. But even more important, from the point of view of the Christology of Matthew, as it is for Mark, Jesus feeds the multitudes. And the way the setting is, it's in a deserted place and insufficient provisions. It evokes the manna. It evokes the memory of Elijah for the widow and her son who were starving. And he has the flask of oil and grains of wheat that multiply. And Elisha feeds 500 people at once in the stories, these great miracle stories of Elijah and Elisha. And also, both these stories anticipate through the gestures of Jesus. He looks up to heaven, he takes the bread, he breaks it and distributes it, and all of the focus in the stories end up on the bread, okay, not on the fish. Okay. And so it evokes the Eucharist. It's hard not to read this and think of it. So this action of Jesus is, recapitulating Yahweh's feeding of Israel in the desert. It recapitulates the great mercy ministries of Elijah and Elisha, the two great prophets of Israel, and it anticipates the feeding of the community that will take place in the future. So these are very powerful stories laden with symbolism that Matthew plants now in this section where the formation of discipleship is so key. And we also note that in here, after the first one, if you double back in chapter 14, we had looked at this story when we were talking about Peter and discipleship earlier, but the walking on the water in chapter 14, verse 22 to 33. And here is a very strong manifestation, a theophany, Jesus speaking, ego eimi, I am. This is really a theophany in the midst of chaos. And then Peter, Matthew splices into this Markan story the account of Peter's walking on the water. And Peter cries out, Kyrie, Lord, save me. Very important title, Kyrios, in the Septuagint, used to translate Adonai, which translates Yahweh. And then in the boat at the end of the story, in verse 33, the disciples, truly you are the Son of God, this full confession. This is high Christology in Matthew's text here. And also woven in this section, I lumped it under here because it is so much of a different modality, if you like, of the healings, and that's the summaries. Look in 1434. They're right before the beginning of chapter 15, right after the walking on the water. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret, and the people of that place recognized him. They sent word throughout the region. They brought all who were sick to him and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. and all who touched it were healed. So these summaries. You have a similar summary in Mark, but Matthew intensifies these, and we'll repeat it at the end of chapter 15. If you take a look at that one, 15:29, we're in the same spot. This one I had alluded to about the location of the healing, but look at the content of this. After Jesus had left that place, he passed along the Sea of Galilee and went up the mountain where he sat down. It's almost identical setting as for the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? And the same way, great crowds come to him. We saw this in chapter 4, verse 23, and following in Matthew. At the beginning of the sermon, the crowds coming from all around, bringing with them the lame, the maimed, the blind, the mute, and many others. They put them at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd was amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. It's a very dramatic scene, this portraying the power of Jesus as healer. So in a section where, we're beginning to turn towards Jerusalem and towards the Passion story, Matthew is portraying Jesus even more intensely in very exalted tones. And we'll see that continues in a moment with sort of the transfiguration that stands in the center of all of this. So, beautiful scene. The other text that's in here that we had talked briefly about is in 15:21. And that has to do with the Canaanite woman. And one of the things to note here, I won't have a chance right now to exploit this, but how much bread is in this section. Okay, we've had the question of the multiplication of the loaves, and then in chapter 15, if this thing about the tradition of the elders, in verse 2, where it says, for they do not wash their hands before they eat, the Greek says before they eat bread, arton. Okay, so it's really a story, it's about washing and so on, and Matthew will reverse this, makes it about their traditions are ill-founded, but it's about eating bread. And then the Canaanite woman story, her riposte to Jesus, who, and if you were to compare this to Mark, you would find that Matthew makes it more excruciating. He rejects the woman 3 times compared to Mark's 2-time rejection. He doesn't even want to speak to her. And yet at the end, she uses this idea that yet even, he says, it's not right to take the bread of the children and throw it to the dogs. But she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. So there's this sense of the bread again, And then you have, in the end of chapter 15, we have another feeding story of the loaves, the breaking of the loaves, the feeding of people, the nourishing of people. That is, such an extension of Jesus' ministry here. So it's a very powerful set of healing stories, even concluding with the story of the epileptic boy. But also coming in here is this motif that we saw last week, opposition to Jesus. And it happens in several things. We won't have time to go through all of these, but notice the role of John again. You remember at the beginning of chapter 11 when Matthew turns to the question of opposition. He sort of brings John the Baptist back in to the scene. Now John is arrested. And we remember when Matthew began the Galilean ministry of Jesus in chapter 4, verse 17, it said after John had been arrested, after he'd been handed over, Jesus entered into Galilee. Then we have in chapter 14, 1 to 13, the story of the execution of John, the prophet. and his disciples coming and taking his body away. And then, if you look at chapter 17, if you don't mind jumping around here, 17:9 and following, after the transfiguration, Jesus compares John the Baptist to Elijah. Okay? So Elijah is the forerunner in the transfiguration. He'll be speaking with Moses and Elijah. Elijah was in the pantheon of the Old Testament. The great prophet is Elijah, the one who's assumed into heaven, the Spirit-filled, O Elijah. There's a great hymns to Elijah in wisdom literature and so on. And so the Elijah who comes to open the Messianic age, here the Gospel of Matthew identifies him with John the Baptist. I tell you in verse 12 that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. And so also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands. So you already have here in chapter 14 the execution of John, the identification of John with Elijah, who comes to announce the coming of the prophet, and what they did to John they're going to do to Jesus. And so there's a hanging over this section already, even before the first passion prediction, attention is being paid to the culmination of the mission of Jesus in Jerusalem. We've had the rejection at Nazareth. I looked at that already. That surrounds the parable chapter. You have this discussion here about the tradition of the elders. Again, it's a sharp conflict between Jesus and the leaders about their traditions. It's very evocative of what went on in the Sermon on the Mount. Hypocrisy, attention to detail, and missing the overall perspective. It's very much what we saw in chapter 23 of the hypocrisy of the leaders. He omits, if you were to look in Mark's Gospel, Mark has a famous text here in chapter 7, verse 19 of Mark. Thus did he declare all foods clean. But Matthew drops that. He doesn't want to go that far to say, I think in Matthew's community, they still observe the kosher laws. For Matthew, again, it's not the law itself. It's not dropping the law, the purity laws, but it's how do you interpret? What is your pivot? And he's already talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount, and will again in chapter 20 about the greatest commandment of the law and so on. It's on these the law and the prophets hang. It has to do with interpretation. The demand for a sign, the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, again, these are all conflicts and rejection that take place. The final segment here, and I beg your pardon for sort of moving rapidly along here, but just at least we can capture the sense of this section of the gospel that's so particularly rich. But Peter's declaration, we had looked at that when we were talking about Peter, but here we need to see it within the framework, as I was talking at the outset, of now the turn in the gospel. With the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, which is a full confession. It replicates what all of the disciples have already said in the walking on the water at the conclusion when Jesus gets into the boat and they fall down, proskunein, and reverence him as truly you are the Son of God. And here now Peter, and we have the blessing of Peter, the leader of the community. And immediately afterwards in verse 21, this great turning point in the northernmost region, Caesarea Philippi. From that time on, there's a phrase, this is another phrase that other interpreters of Matthew have said, here's a big turning point. The evangelist is underscoring this. It's in Greek, it's apotota. From that time on, he began to speak his disciples, to show his disciples, he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, on the third day be raised. And you have here Peter, taking him aside, began to rebuke him, epitimao, to silence him, to attempt to silence him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. The irony of this. And he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, if you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. We had talked about this before. You are the rock on which I would build the church. You are the scandalon, the stumbling rock as well to me. So Peter takes two different roles here of solidity. And then you can see, look in verse 24, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves. This is what you find in Mark, the passion predictions and the misunderstanding of the disciples, followed by these intense sayings about discipleship in the light of the cross. Also, as in Mark, finally, the transfiguration takes place. And notice the evangelist Mark has already done this 6 days later. So there's a connection between Peter's confession, Jesus' first prediction of the passion, and the disciples not getting it, Peter not getting it in this instance, and Jesus' instruction about the rigors of discipleship, and then the transfiguration. This is a section that's kept in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And here, like we had with the walking on the water, the stilling of the storm, this is a high theophany. This is an intense manifestation of Emmanuel, the divine presence shining through here. He was transfigured, his face shone like the sun, his clothes became dazzling white. There appeared to him Moses and Elijah talking with him. And one of the differences between Mark's version and Matthew's version, it takes place in the response of Peter. Peter, in Mark's gospel, says something similar. It's good for us to be here. I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then Mark adds, he didn't know what he was talking about. He was so confused. Peter was so confused he didn't understand. But for Matthew, Peter's not misunderstanding. He's responding appropriately, and to have the tabernacles, the 3 tents for the disciples here. And while he's speaking, the bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice, this is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And here in this verse, you sense what the purpose of this is. This glimpse of Jesus with the kabod, the divine presence manifest, shining through him, almost like the reflected light off of Moses' face when he sees God at Sinai. You remember that Paul speaks about this, the transfigured face as he's been in the divine presence. Here it's emanating from Jesus, and the voice from heaven declaring, this is my son, my beloved, listen to him. And so all of the instruction that's going to come here about discipleship, all of the intense speech about forgiveness and so on that we'll see in chapter 18, all of the discussions about the future, all of this sort of is under the endorsement of listen to him. The voice of God is spoken. The voice of God spoke already in chapter 3 at the baptism. This is my son, my beloved. And here it's reinforced by listen to him. Again, the identification of Jesus as the son, the beloved. So this is really, the affirmation of the authority of Jesus in Matthew's gospel. And here you sense that he's, Moses and Elijah are, very key figures, obviously, within the history of Israel, but Jesus is transcending them. the focus is on Jesus at the end of the story. So in this section of the gospel, we see Matthew following Mark, but he injects into this section where we're beginning to think of the Passion sort of appropriately with our liturgical season upon us. Mark speaks of the Passion and discipleship instruction, but Matthew intensifies all of it. He intensifies the portrayal of Jesus with his high Christology. Not that Mark doesn't have a high Christology, he does, but Matthew enriches it with these accounts and reaffirms the authority and power of Jesus through the miracles and through the conflict. So it's one of the things I keep as I review the materials, and the more detailed you go into them, as somebody said, if you look at the brush strokes, and the comparisons of Mark and Matthew here, where Matthew retains so much of Mark, but subtly, enhances and changes it and puts in his own perspectives, that you see the fearlessness of the early Christian community of reinterpreting tradition. I really think that for Matthew's community, the Gospel of Mark was known and revered, but they also sensed that there were things happening to them that were not happening to Mark's community. And part of it is retrieving the Jewish context of Jesus. We see that in the tradition of the elders, not seeing this as a total abnegation of the kosher laws. That Matthew, that's not the way he would see it, or bringing in references to the Old Testament to show that what Jesus is doing is not disregarding the law, but interpreting it in a different way, and using titles, kurios, and Son of God, and so on, in a much more liberal way, if you like, liberal in the sense of more profuse than you have in Mark's text. So you have a Christian community that's working with received tradition, but enhancing it in view of their own circumstances and proclaiming it. Was part of the Jewish tradition to do that, and it's also part of the Christian tradition, and it was already taking place in these texts, much less going on later with definitions and councils and so on. So thank you all again for your attention. We're working our way. Next week we're going to look at chapter 18, the community discourse, which I think is a particularly beautiful part of the Gospel of Matthew, and we can use it not only to look at that text, but to try to get a sense of sort of Matthew's ecclesiology. What was his vision of the church? He's the only gospel writer to use the term church, ecclesia. And he uses it 3 times. One is in chapter 16 and twice in chapter 18. So he is concerned about it, and we can take a look at what it means for him. So safe home, everybody. I'll put the...